Bootstrap, Tailwind, and Material UI. These are just three of many UI libraries that make it very easy for you to write websites. In this video, we want to talk about which one of these might be emerging as the winner. We'll go through some open source projects and see which library is being used most often. And we'll also be writing some code to understand the key differences between these libraries. With that, let's get right into it. So to begin with, what are UI libraries? They are just very nicely written packages that you can use to style your websites and make them pretty, so that you don't have to write raw CSS yourself. Believe it or not, most companies use a UI library. No one is out there writing raw CSS. There are multiple reasons for this. One, these libraries have been written by designers and really smart people, so they are very well optimized, and it's much easier to just use the knowledge of these people than writing all of these components yourself. You can always tweak them for your website, but generally it's a good idea to use one of these libraries that's out there. What are these libraries? I'll name a few here. There's Tailwind, there's Material UI, there's Bootstrap, there's Radix, there's Chakra, there's Shad CN, and the list is frankly never ending. But there are key differences in what these libraries provide. Let me put a 0 point here. Let me call it raw CSS. What is raw CSS? This is the CSS that you usually write when you're just learning to understand HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, which means you have an HTML file, and along with that, you either have a CSS file or you are writing inline CSS through your project. This, as I said, is probably not the right way to learn how to build production-worthy websites, because no one in the real world is using raw CSS. So the question comes, which one of these 6 libraries should I use? Let's understand some key differences between them. Tailwind, you can think of as just a wrapper on top of the existing CSS that you used to write. What do I mean by this? Let's look at some code here. I have rewritten the ChatGPT sign up page in Tailwind CSS. So if you look at the page, it looks something like this. There is a nav bar at the top. There is some text here. There are 2 buttons here, and there is a get started text here. If you look at the code, it looks something like this. If we focus just on this ChatGPT text at the top left, you'll notice I've wrapped it around a div, and the div has some specific classes associated with it. Specifically, the first one says ML-5, which means leave a margin on the left. That's what M and L stand for, of 5. If I make this smaller, the distance between this and this will become smaller. As you can see, if I make it bigger again, as you can see, the distance increased again. So what does this class let you do? It's very similar to me writing something like this. This, more specifically, this and this mean the same thing. Similarly, there are a bunch of other classes that I've associated to this specific div. This is what Tailwind lets you do. It's highly unopinionated. Its only purpose is to let you write CSS in a slightly cleaner fashion. You could totally convert this to this by adding margin top, color, font weight, font size. This and this are exactly the same, but why is this preferred? Because this is a much easier way to write CSS rather than writing margin left 5. ML5 is much smaller, much easier to understand, very easy to conjecture. ML means left and MT means the margin on the top. This is the first library that we've talked about, and the whole ChatGPT page that you see here has been written in Tailwind. If you look at the file from top to bottom, it's a bunch of native HTML elements, div, H3, H4, and we don't import anything from Tailwind. We simply use the CSS classes that Tailwind provides us, which is significantly different from other frameworks. We will see another one very soon. Feel free to look at the website. The code is linked in the description, but at a high level, this div represents this thing right here. This H3 represents the title. This H4 represents the subtitle. These are the 2 native HTML buttons. And this is the get started text right here. Everything is pure HTML and Tailwind classes. Now let's move to the second library, called Material UI and see how MUI is significantly different from Tailwind. So let's focus on Material UI now. Material UI is not a wrapper on top of HTML CSS. It is a highly opinionated framework, which means it gives you a bunch of React components that you have to import into your project. It'll give you a button component. It'll give you a typography component. And it'll expect you to use these components and whatever is the logic inside it, that Material UI owns. If I go to Material UI docs, you can see it gives you a bunch of components that you can bring to your project. It doesn't natively give you access to style them, and it expects you to use those components rather than using a native button or a native H3, H4 div component. For example, let's look at the button component in Material UI. It gives you 3 types of components, and this is the code you need to bring into your machine to be able to bring this exact style onto your website. What is the problem here? It's highly opinionated. What do I mean by that? Okay, they have only provided 3 types of buttons. They have a very specific style. For example, if I hover over this, the color changes a bit. If I click on it, there is a ripple that appears. This is their opinion as to how websites should be built. And that is what you have to accept/deal with when you're bringing this to your website. It does provide you ways to make changes. You can style it a different way, but then you're just injecting raw CSS in here, which sort of takes away the benefit of it being an external library. Let's look at the code to understand this slightly better. If you look at the Material UI website, it looks very similar. This is the Material UI website. And if you look at the code here, at the top, you will see a bunch of imports that I do from @MUI/material. This is what ruffles a few feathers with developers. Okay, I don't want to reuse that API in my project. I want to write it myself. And this is the biggest difference between Material UI and Tailwind. It lets you write raw HTML and a cleaner way to write CSS. MUI, on the other hand, gives you highly opinionated components, which are slightly harder to customize. So as your website grows, you sort of have to agree to how they've written their front-end framework. For example, as you saw, the native button that they provide us is pretty small. The padding on the left and the top isn't as much, but the ChatGPT landing page has a very big button that's present. Now the button API does let you specify a size, but there are only 3 versions of the size, none of which are as big as this specific button. This is where you'll start to see problems. You have to customize this button a lot. And if you had to customize it, there's no point of relying on someone else. And there's no chance in hell that they can create like 20 different variants, one of which you might use for your project. Now you can customize the sizes inside Material UI. You can be like, yeah, bhai, I want a lot of space. And in that case, if you pass in a size large here, you can get something like this. But you can see how this can become a problem. Let's see how I built these big buttons. I had to use something called styled components, which basically means I had to inject raw CSS to the original button and create a new large button class that I can use. Let's look at the code from top to bottom. I define a full screen styled component. Now this has nothing to do with Material UI. It's just cleaner to write components like these if you're using Material UI rather than writing something like div style equal to width 100 VW, height 100 VH. It's just easier to create components because that's what Material UI gives you as well. And the styling library that we're using here @emotion/styled is the library that Material UI recommends on their homepage. If you go to Material UI here, you'll see it asks you to not just install Material UI, but also install @emotion/react and @emotion/styled. This is the library that I'm using here because this is the way Material UI sort of expects you to create components like these. You don't have to, but if you are going down the Material UI route, it's a good idea to follow what the developers are telling you. Then what are they telling you? They're saying if there's something we don't provide you, create them using this library rather than writing raw HTML CSS in your code base. That's what I've done here. Why have I done this? Because the ChatGPT website is full screen, which is why the very top level div needs to take the complete width and the complete height. There's some theme logic here, feel free to ignore, but this is how the right set of colors reach this button, this side, so on and so forth. The large button component I talked about, and then finally the landing component, which actually renders the whole thing. I use something called grid here, which is again something that Material UI provides me to actually lay out the page correctly, make sure that this part takes up a certain amount of width, the other one takes slightly lesser width. I use typography here, I use large button here. So these are like outsourced components, which are not the best thing in the world for you to use. It's much cleaner. It might not feel cleaner. Here, this seems much uglier. than simply writing typography variant equal to h4. But as time goes by, you don't want to be reliant on an external library which might do something weird inside this typography component. So you will eventually at some point start to resort to writing things like h4 directly here. And if you're doing that, it's much easier to style it this way using Tailwind rather than styling it using inline styles. So hopefully that gives you a clear distinction between what Material UI provides you and what Tailwind provides you. These are usually the biggest comparators that companies are, conflicted on which one to choose. The high level difference to keep in mind is that Tailwind lets you access / use raw HTML tags, gives you a clean way to write CSS, and Material UI gives you opinionated components, very hard to do customization here. That's the high level difference between these two libraries. These are the libraries that people are usually conflicted with. Iske baad, let me talk through a few more libraries that I've written about. Bootstrap is the OG library. It might have been the library you started with. This is the library that I started with. Back then it felt like, wow, like it took away so much pain. I don't have to write. I'm not a designer, so it's very hard to write like clean, nice UIs. So what Bootstrap would give you, one of the first libraries to give you a way to create nice websites without having too many design skills. You could just yoink their styles and put them in your website. Today as well, a bunch of websites run on Bootstrap, but I wouldn't say this is the most popular or even like remotely popular framework being used in remote startups or good companies around the world. Radix is a third type of library that we should probably talk about. We've talked about two types of libraries until now, Tailwind and MUI. Hopefully you understand the high level difference between these two. The third framework that came into the picture was, or the third type of framework that sort of exists is, Radix is one of those, which are called unstyled JS-based UI frameworks. What does this mean? The very first word here says unstyled, which means these guys' purpose is not to provide any styles. They won't give you clean looking, beautiful UIs. They serve a different purpose. And the purpose is to give you very complex JavaScript based components out of the box. Now, what do I mean by that? If you look at Material UI, the components that it gives you is, one of them, those components is this accordion, which is basically something like this you might have seen on websites. It expands and contracts. If you use Material UI, all you have to do is bring in this code right here to your code base and you get an accordion like this, because Material UI, the components that these guys have exposed have some JavaScript written inside it. Tailwind has no JavaScript. Tailwind only owns CSS, gives you a way to write CSS in a slightly cleaner syntax. This should tell you there is one big gaping hole in Tailwind. What is the gaping hole? If you have to write things like these, a modal or an accordion, you'll have to write all this JavaScript logic yourself, which is where libraries like Radix came into the picture. And they said, okay, we don't really own styling. You use Tailwind for styling or something else. We own unstyled JavaScript components, which are very hard for you to write as a developer. So we will own that a bit. If I go to the Radix website, you will see the kind of components it provides you is things like an alert dialog. So if I click on this, I see an alert dialog. This is JavaScript logic that would run when you click on this revoke button, this cancel button, which is why Tailwind is not enough to create something like this, and Radix came into the picture. The ideal stack in my mind is using Tailwind along with Radix, and we will see one open source project very soon that uses exactly this stack. Before we do that, let's discuss all the other libraries I was talking about. Chakra is sort of a combination of Tailwind and Material UI. I basically call it very similar to Material UI, which is highly opinionated components that you can reuse. And Shad CN is an interesting one. The one thing that you might have noticed, or that's common across the first 5-6 libraries, is that they require some sort of an npm install. You bring, for example, when you're working with Material UI or Bootstrap, Radix, Chakra, any one of these, you do an npm install, whatever, like at MUI/material or Tailwind or the other libraries, they expect you to bring a library locally. Shad CN took a different approach. They said, okay, Radix exists as a very nice library. Tailwind exists as a very nice library. Tailwind gives you style. Radix gives you a bunch of components. I will write down in a file some very clean components that use a combination of Tailwind and Radix, and you just copy them over to your code base and you're good to go. It does not really expect you to use them out of the box, which is why I would call Shad CN also unopinionated, because it doesn't expect you to use their components out of the box. It just, you can think of it just as a website that has a bunch of templates that you can just copy paste into your code base. And if there's something that you don't like there, you can just change it and go from there. So that's sort of a new type of UI library that came into the picture that's been catching up heat as well. So I'd probably put this up there as well. So to summarize, what libraries would I learn today? I would at least learn Tailwind very well. A lot of projects only use Tailwind. They don't need fancy accordion-like components. And if they do, they write them themselves. If I had to go one step further, I would learn Radix, but Tailwind is a good starting point because you don't know from there what kind of other libraries people will bring into their code bases. I'm not saying Material UI is bad. I'm saying a project that's sort of out there in production that is dependent on front end. There are a bunch of projects that people don't care about the front end of. For example, any backend heavy project, if you look at Kafka UI or like Kubernetes UI dashboards, they look pretty ugly. No one cares. Even if they're written raw CSS, it's fine. And in that case, it provides a lot of benefit to the backend developer if they can just reuse components like Material UI provides you. So in that case, it's fine. But if you want to be like a core UI developer and you want to join a customer-facing company, most probably Tailwind or any similarly written framework might be the framework that will be used here. And I said in the beginning of the video, I'll take you through a few open source projects. Let's go through cal.com and dub.sh, which are two open source projects that are written really well. If I go to cal.com, most probably in the packages/UI folder is where all the components will be present. If I look at any of these components, for example, even button is probably a better one. If I look at the button component right here, you will see the thing that it returns is a div with a class name, and these are all Tailwind classes, which means cal.com does use Tailwind. And if I go to dub.sh, again, packages/UI is where usually people shove all their UI components. If I go to button.txt here, I will see a bunch of Tailwind classes. So both of these use Tailwind. Dub.sh, if I go to some fancy accordion component here, you will see it comes from Radix UI. So dub.sh is basically the project that uses Radix and Tailwind. At this point, if you have to create an accordion-like component, you either have to write it yourself, which is really bad. It's like, it won't be optimal. It's just easy to use something that's already been written. So you'll either think of a very dumb thing that you'll bring Material UI to your project. Don't do that. Use something like Radix, which was built for this. Yeah, we provide you components that are hard to write, that require a lot of JavaScript logic, but we're an unstyled small library. That is the purpose we serve. Don't bring in Material UI here and have like a jank of Material UI and Tailwind in the same project. This was the reason that Radix was written, and a bunch of other libraries that upfront say we are unstyled libraries. So whatever is your styling library, you use that. Along with that, use us for JavaScript heavy components. One more thing that you might notice here is all these guys, like open source projects, shove all their components in a separate package called UI. So they have opinion as to what their button component should look like. If I go to UI source button.tsx, this button component has 3 variants or 4 variants: primary, secondary, success, danger. Now this is an opinionated component. Yeah, bhai, I expect one of 4 variants. That is all I support. I don't support I don't know, yellow color, for example, because it does not have like a warning variant. At some point it might get it, but right now it has primary, secondary, success, and danger. So it is highly opinionated. But whose opinion is this? This is the project maintainer's opinion. So final website will never have logic that looks like whatever div class name equal to background dash yellow. You don't want that. You can write that, but you want to encapsulate all of that in this UI package. This is sort of your design system. This contains your buttons, accordions, tables, warnings, images, models, all these things. And your final website is supposed to just use this UI as the Material UI library. I will repeat. You sort of write your own version of Material UI, which is highly opinionated components, but under the hood you use Tailwind, which is unopinionated. And based on your use case, you expose the right set of things. For example, this guy exposed 4 variants of buttons, which could be primary, secondary, success or danger. Cool. Hopefully that was clear and you got a decent understanding of what to pick. What is the high level learning from the video? It is to at least learn Tailwind and maybe learn Tailwind with Radix and try to contribute to one of these projects. So at least UI part is clear. UI doesn't change very often. Like if you look at any big project's UI folder, whenever there is some new page that's coming in, usually the hope is you're able to reuse a bunch of these components, the styles, the colors, the buttons, the tables. So this package doesn't change too often. So even as a backend developer, a full stack developer, there's not too many changes needed here. So just become very comfortable with Tailwind. I think it will serve you well in the long term. That's the high level learning from the video. With that, let's end it. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.